Is that what happened? Yes.
Concerned a jury might send her to prison for life, Bustamante pled guilty to a charge of second-degree murder and a sentence of 30 years in prison.
A 9-year-old girl vanished from a quiet street in Missouri. The person who knew exactly where she was had been living only a few houses away the whole time. Her name was Elizabeth Olten. In October of 2009, she disappeared from a small community called St. Martin's. For 2 days, hundreds of people searched for her through cold rain. They were looking for a missing child. What they found instead was something no one in that town could have imagined. And the person responsible was only 15 years old. If stories like this deserve to be remembered, stay with me. Elizabeth's name should not be forgotten. Elizabeth K. Olten was 9 years old. She was in the 4th grade. She lived with her family in St. Martin's, a small, close community in Missouri. Pink was reportedly her favorite color. She had a school life, a family, and a future ahead of her. She was a child who liked simple things, the way most 9-year-olds do. She had people who loved her. She had plans, even if they were small ones. A next birthday, a next school year, a next summer. Before this story becomes about the person who took her life, it has to be about her first. Elizabeth was more than the last day of her life. Only a few houses away lived a teenage girl named Alyssa Bustamante. She was 15 years old. She attended Jefferson City High School, and by most accounts, she was a capable student. She ranked somewhere in the top third of her class. She had no criminal record. She had never been in serious trouble at school. On the surface, she looked like an ordinary teenager living an ordinary life. But underneath that surface, there was something else going on. Alyssa had a documented history of depression. She had received mental health treatment. At around age 13, she reportedly attempted suicide. She had a history of self-harm. At times, she left home without permission and reportedly spent nights outdoors in wooded areas. Her online profiles later revealed troubling material. None of this explains what happened next. And none of it excuses it. But it is part of the record, and a fair telling of this story has to include it. According to prosecutors, what happened to Elizabeth was not sudden. It was planned. In early October of 2009, on a day when school was not in session, Alyssa reportedly went into the wooded area near her neighborhood. She dug 2 holes in the ground. Investigators later said they believed these holes were meant to be used as graves. Why there were 2 holes, and not 1, was never fully explained in the available records. So, we won't guess. What we do know is that she returned to school afterward, and she waited. On the evening of October 21st, 2009, Elizabeth disappeared. She and Alyssa lived only a short distance apart in the same small neighborhood. When Elizabeth did not come home, her family grew worried. They contacted the authorities. And what began as a missing child report quickly grew into something much larger. Word spread through St. Martin's fast. A 9-year-old girl was missing. Neighbors who had never met each other before stood side by side, calling her name into the trees. Law enforcement officers arrived. Volunteers came. Friends of the family came. Within hours, what started as a small search had become a community-wide effort involving hundreds of people. The weather did not make it easy. It was cold. It rained for much of the search. The ground was wet, the woods were thick, and visibility was poor. Still, people kept looking. Some searched through the night. Most of them were still hoping for the outcome every parent prays for, that somewhere out there, Elizabeth was cold, scared, and alive. But alive. So why would a killer stay so close to the search itself? That question would only make sense once investigators understood what they were dealing with. As the search entered its second day, investigators began gathering evidence, both physical and written. Cole County Sheriff Greg White later said that this evidence pointed them towards someone very close to home. Officers began looking closely at Alyssa. Among the material investigators found was something deeply disturbing: private writing that appeared to describe a killing. They brought Alyssa in for questioning. According to Missouri State Highway Patrol Sergeant David Rice, who later testified in court, Alyssa confessed during that interview. Sergeant Rice testified that she told investigators she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. That single reported statement would go on to define how the entire country understood this case. After the confession, Alyssa reportedly agreed to lead investigators to Elizabeth. She walked them into the woods near their homes, to a shallow grave she had helped create days before. On October 23rd, 2 days after Elizabeth disappeared, her body was found. The search that had brought together an entire community ended not with relief, but with devastation. According to prosecutors, and later confirmed through Alyssa's own guilty plea, Elizabeth had been strangled and cut with a knife. That is the extent of what needs to be said here. The details were painful, and they do not need to be repeated in full. What matters is that a 9-year-old girl lost her life at the hands of someone who lived only a few houses away. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in this entire case came from Alyssa's own journal. In an entry she reportedly wrote that same night, she described the killing. She wrote about feeling nervous and shaken at first. Then she described something that troubled investigators and the public even more. She wrote that, after getting past her initial hesitation, she found the experience exciting. She also wrote that she went to church afterward. We are not going to read that journal entry in full here. It is graphic, and repeating it in detail would not honor Elizabeth's memory. But its existence mattered enormously in court. It became one of the clearest pieces of evidence that this was not an accident, and not a moment of confusion. It was something Alyssa understood, in her own words, as it was happening. After her arrest, reporters and investigators also found troubling material connected to social media accounts believed to belong to her posts referencing violence, fear, and death. This online material does not prove what happened in the woods, but it explains, in part, why this case shocked people far beyond Missouri. Because Alyssa was only 15, the court first had to decide something important. Would she remain in the juvenile system, or would she be tried as an adult? This single decision would shape the rest of her life. If she stayed in juvenile court, the focus would shift toward treatment and rehabilitation. But Missouri's juvenile system could not necessarily hold her past the age of 21. And officials said the state lacked a fully secure juvenile facility for female offenders. If she were tried as an adult, she would face first-degree murder and armed criminal action charges that could mean life in prison without any possibility of parole. Her attorney, Kurt Valentine, argued that she should remain in the juvenile system. He pointed to her age, her depression, her suicide attempt, and her history of self-harm. He warned that placing a 15-year-old in the adult prison system could put her life at risk. After her arrest, Alyssa reportedly tried to injure herself using her own fingernails while in custody, which only strengthened his concerns. On the other side, Cole County's chief juvenile officer, David Cook, recommended she be tried as an adult. The state pointed to the planning involved the pre-dug holes, the week of waiting, the concealment of the body, and her own confession. Cole County Circuit Judge John Beadham sided with the state. He ruled that Alyssa would be tried as an adult, citing the seriousness of the crime and the limits of the juvenile system. On November 18, 2009, Alyssa was formally indicted as an adult. She was charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. A judge entered a not guilty plea on her behalf, and she was held without bond. If convicted, as charged, she was facing life in prison with no possibility of ever being released. In the courtroom, the divide was visible. Alyssa's mother and grandmother sat on one side. Elizabeth's family and supporters sat on the other. Several of them wore pink, in honor of the little girl whose favorite color it had been. For more than 2 years, the case moved slowly through the courts. Prosecutors built their case around the confession, the journal, and the evidence linking Alyssa to the pre-dug grave. The defense focused on her mental health. They presented evidence that she had been taking the antidepressant Prozac, and that her dosage had been increased only about 2 weeks before the killing. A psychiatrist for the defense, Dr. Edwin Johnstone, testified that medications like this had, in some reported cases, been linked to violent or suicidal behavior. Prosecutor Mark Richardson pushed back, noting that the EFTA had never determined that Prozac causes someone to commit murder. This remained a contested argument in court. It was never established as scientific or legal fact. It was one piece of a much larger picture the defense tried to present. A trial on first-degree murder was scheduled for January 30th, 2012. Had it gone forward, and had Alyssa been convicted as originally charged, she would likely have spent the rest of her life in prison with no chance of release. But that trial never happened. On January 10th, 2012, just weeks before it was set to begin, Alyssa pleaded guilty, not to first-degree murder, but to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. She was almost 18 years old by then. In court, Judge Patricia Joyce asked her directly what she had done. Alyssa said she understood what she was doing at the time. She admitted to cutting Elizabeth with a knife. She admitted to strangling her. Elizabeth's mother sat nearby as she spoke, and she reacted with visible grief. The plea meant Alyssa avoided the uncertainty of a trial and avoided the possibility of a sentence that would have offered no chance of release, ever. For the prosecution, it meant a guaranteed conviction, without the risks a jury trial can carry. At the sentencing hearing weeks later, both sides made their case one final time. Prosecutors pointed again to Elizabeth's age, the planning behind the crime, the violence involved, and the devastation left behind for her family and community. The defense pointed again to Alyssa's youth, her depression, her suicide attempt, her medication, and the possibility that she could still change. Alyssa spoke directly to Elizabeth's family. She apologized. She said that words could never fully capture how horrible she felt. She said she would give her own life if it could bring Elizabeth back. It was a stark contrast to the words she had written in her journal on the night of the killing. The court was left to weigh that contrast, genuine remorse on one side, chilling detail written in her own hand on the other. On February 8, 2012, Judge Patricia Joyce handed down the sentence. Alyssa received life in prison with the possibility of parole for second-degree murder, plus an additional 30 years for armed criminal action. The sentences were ordered to run one after the other, not at the same time. Cole County prosecutor Mark Richardson called the sentence appropriate for the killing of an innocent child. He reminded the public that hundreds of people had searched for Elizabeth through cold rain before she was ever found. Defense attorneys called the punishment harsh, arguing that a 15-year-old's brain and judgment are not the same as an adult's, and that she deserved a real chance at rehabilitation. The case did not end there. In the years that followed, major decisions from the United States Supreme Court began reshaping how the country treats life sentences for juvenile offenders. Courts increasingly recognize that teenagers are different from adults. Their brains are still developing, their impulse control is different, and their capacity for change may be greater. Alyssa's attorneys used these developments to challenge her original plea. They argued about her age at the time of the crime, and whether the changing legal landscape should affect her sentence. Her request for a new trial was ultimately denied. Then, in 2021, Missouri lawmakers changed the state's juvenile sentencing code. Under the new law, most juvenile offenders became eligible for a parole hearing after serving 15 years, with one exception: those convicted of first-degree murder. Because Alyssa had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, not first-degree, this change opened a door that many people believed had been permanently closed. Elizabeth's family did not stay silent. They supported new legislation that would prevent parole for juveniles convicted of either first or second-degree murder. That effort became part of a bill known as Senate Bill 754. Missouri's Governor, Mike Parson, was expected to sign it in July of 2024. But timing mattered here in a painful way. Alyssa's parole hearing was held on July 8, 2024, one day before the governor was scheduled to sign the bill. And the new law was not expected to take effect until the end of August. That meant the hearing already scheduled could not be stopped by legislation that had not yet taken effect. The hearing itself was closed to the public. Cole County prosecutor Locke Thompson said he was prepared to strongly oppose her release. Parole decisions in Missouri often take 6 to 10 weeks to be announced. As of the most recent reporting available, no final decision had been made public. So the question remains open, more than 15 years after Elizabeth disappeared. Should someone who committed a crime this serious, at only 15 years old, ever have a real chance at release? Those who oppose it point to the planning, the concealment, the reported motive of simple curiosity, and a family that has never gotten Elizabeth back. Those who support the possibility of parole point to Alyssa's age at the time, her documented mental health struggles, and the belief that a hearing is not a guarantee, it is only a chance to be considered. There may not be an answer that satisfies everyone, but there is one fact that does not change, no matter how the legal system rules. Elizabeth Olten was 9 years old. She should have grown up. She should have finished school, found the things she loved, and built a life of her own. Instead, her name became tied forever to one of Missouri's most disturbing cases. Whatever happens with parole hearings, whatever the courts eventually decide, none of it can undo what was lost. Elizabeth deserves to be remembered not only as a case file, and not only as a headline. She deserves to be remembered as a child who mattered, and whose future was taken from her far too soon.